guest tonight is Jim DiEugenio. He's an author who covers political assassinations in the United States. He's written 2 books. The first one was called Destiny Betrayed, and that was published a couple of years ago, and that was about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. After that, he published another book called The Assassinations. This was published recently with a woman whose name, I'm going to get very fast here. Her name is Lisa Peace. And that book was just recently published, and that's called The Assassinations, and it covers 4 assassinations: JFK, RFK, Malcom X, Martin Luther King. Of course, not in that order, but we'll probably get to that in our discussion. And he was also the editor of a magazine with Lisa. He and Jim and Lisa published a magazine called Probe from 1993 to 2000. So tonight, in recognition of the anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, which is coming up this April 4th, we're basically going to be talking about that assassination and also its relationship to the other assassinations. So let me introduce you to my guest tonight, Jim DiEugenio. Hi, Jim.
My pleasure.
Thank you for coming. So here's the key question. I'll bet you everybody who knows you've authored this book asks it. So there's been many books and movies about assassinations. Most of these assassinations occurred between 63 and 70 or 68. I mean, it's in that period of time, the late 60s. Mm-hmm. That's, geez, it's like 30 years ago. Why write another book about the same material?
Well, that's the point, is it's not the same material. What we did in our book, and this is why the book is so unique and why it's so kind of unusual, is that what most people don't understand is that on the John F. Kennedy case, for example, the government was withholding from the public view approximately 2 to 3 million pages of documents. And in the 1990s, after the sensational controversy over Oliver Stone's film JFK, the government was forced to set up an agency to start declassifying these documents. And it took them about 3.5, 4 years to do so. And very, very, very few people, knew about it, and almost nobody read them. So we decided to do this journal called Probe, which would go ahead and actually read these documents, okay, and actually write articles based upon the new information that nobody had ever seen before that was in these documents. And there was a lot of very interesting stuff. You didn't hear about it through the main media, of course, because they basically ignored it.
So you became an expert on the documents that were released. Mm-hmm. In what year were they released?
They were released approximately from 1993 to about 1997.
And you started working on them over this time period.
Right.
And actually had to create a magazine to release your articles.
Right.
That's a lot of hard work, a
Yes,
lot of coffee you had to drink and stuff.
Yeah.
Did anything come of that? I mean, you mentioned this movie.
Right. I was Oliver, when they re-released a double disc on DVD of JFK, Oliver Stone called me up and said he wanted me to do a commentary on the film, on the second disc, because he basically said, Jim, the beating I took over this movie, everybody said I was nutty and it was all, made up, and said, I know you're probably one of the only people in America who's actually read these new documents, so I want you to go on and tell everybody that, hey, this guy turned out to be correct on most of the things he said in the picture. And so I did about a 30-minute commentary on the DVD version of JFK.
Okay, great. So can people go out and get that? Or?
Well, they can, except it's the one that's released before the 40th anniversary. I'm on that one. I'm not on the actual new one. Warner Brothers, I think, got a little queasy about putting me on the new one, okay, because of some of the things I said on the old one, which actually was a lot of, that essay got a lot of attention in the reviews of the DVD, all right?
Okay, so let's move on. So that was 93 to 97, you're researching, you made the magazine.
Right, and that's how we got into this new stuff on the King case. We decided to kind of broaden the scope of the magazine to include not just the JFK, but also Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. And those are the essays that are extracted in the book. On the Martin Luther King case, see, like very few people know about the release of the new documents in the JFK case. Very few people know that there was actually a trial on the murder to kill, on the murder conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King.
A trial?
Yes, there was a trial. And see, hardly anybody knows about this. The media basically ignored it. All right, and the verdict in the case was the jury came back with a verdict of conspiracy in the Martin Luther King case. So now we have a verdict, adjudicated court verdict in that case that says that Martin Luther King was killed as a result of conspiracy.
Okay, but just for the sticklers out there, there was a jury case on the Martin Luther King assassination.
Right.
Okay, so, I mean, it had been conceded that it was James Earl Ray.
Right.
But another case was held, like an appeal or something, right? Where was this jury held and when?
Let me explain how this whole trial came about, since, like I said, very few people know anything about it. What happened was that a man named Loyd Jowers, who owned a kind of deli in Memphis, went on television with Sam Donaldson, okay, on ABC, in I think 1994, 1995. And he said that he had been a part of a conspiracy to go ahead and kill Martin Luther King, and that James Earl Ray had not been the trigger man, in the conspiracy. Of course, this created a lot of controversy in the case, all right? And so William Pepper, who had been the attorney of record for James Earl Ray, began to pursue this. And so before James Earl Ray died in 1997, he tried to get a new trial based on the new evidence, okay, to go ahead and try the case again. But two things happened down in Memphis, okay? Number one, the judge in the case, Judge Joe Brown, looked like he was actually going to reopen the case. And when that happened, everything went loose. I mean, the city of Memphis, the state of Tennessee, the national media, etc., managed to get him removed from that case. And of course, he went on to become a syndicated judge on daytime TV. Okay,
What's his name?
Judge Joe Brown.
Okay.
He has a Judge Joe Brown show on TV. All right.
So they paid him off with celebrity.
I'm not saying
I know
that.
you didn't say that. I said it.
Okay.
I said it. You didn't say it. I said it.
All right. And so he was removed from the case. All right. And so then James Earl Ray died. The state of Tennessee refused to export him to Pittsburgh, which is like 300 miles away, to get a kidney transplant. And so he died before Pepper could conclude the process of trying to get him a new trial. So we covered all this in the magazine, and the essays are in the book. So then what happened is the King family, okay, Dexter King, Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King Jr. and their two sisters, okay, decided to file charges against Loyd Jowers on this conspiracy count. Okay, this ended up being a civil trial held in Memphis.
Okay, so just to review, Loyd Jowers is the one who publicly confessed to being involved in a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King.
Correct. Okay. So they went ahead and filed a case, all right, and it was a trial, and I think that lasted about 3 weeks, all right, and the jury came back and said that Jowers was involved. They agreed with the Kings that Jowers was involved in a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, all right? And so we, by the way, this is very interesting. Everybody remembers the whole O.J. Simpson case debacle, in which you had something like, I don't know, anywhere from 500 to 2,000 journalists camped in L.A. covering this so-called great trial of the century, et cetera, all right? Well, here you really did have a really important trial down in Memphis, correct? All right? And do you know how many journalists were actually in that room every single day of the trial? One. Ours.
Yours?
Jim Douglas, yeah. Jim Douglas, who did the reporting on that for Probe magazine, was the only journalist in the courtroom every day.
Well, let me challenge you for a second now, without revealing all the details, because there's too much to go over, and people got to buy the book and read it, or they can go search on the internet if they don't want to read the book. But I mean, what's the big deal if it wasn't James Earl Ray, but it was like the Knights of Columbus or some other rednecks down there, or some Klansmen, or some good old boys who decided to knock off King? All right, you know, it's unfortunate and it's big, but it's not a big political issue.
Oh, I couldn't disagree more.
Why not?
I couldn't disagree more. Because, first of all, you have to ask the question, well, why did they frame James Earl Ray? Why did they not allow him a trial? You know, why did he serve, 30 years in jail, if he didn't do it, okay? And then you have to ask, well, then if he didn't do it, who did it and how come they killed him? And why did that particular assassination, and it's another thing most people don't understand. The assassination of Martin Luther King is April the 4th, 1968. The assassination of Robert F. Kennedy here in Los Angeles took place almost precisely 60 days later, on June the 4th, 1968. Okay? Now, I ask you, was that a coincidence that both these people died under mysterious circumstances, 2 months apart, in cases that, if they were tried in open court today, would not, they wouldn't go beyond a week? It's clearly, both cases were the result of a conspiracy. All right? So I think it's important politically, and historically, and that's why we wrote this book, especially the afterword, as to what happened in America and why we face the circumstances we do today.
You're saying that there was it wasn't, let's say, race hatred or revenge,
No.
There was a point.
The evidence produced in court says that it was a grand conspiracy between the Central Intelligence Agency, okay, the Pentagon, and the Mafia, in order to kill King. That's the stuff that Pepper produced in court.
The CIA.
Yes, the Mafia.
The Mafia.
Okay, and the Pentagon.
And the Pentagon.
Right.
And those are actually 3 separate organizations.
Okay.
Really?
Yes.
At the time that occurred, 68, just to refresh everybody's memory, who was the reigning president at the time? Whose watch was that?
Okay, well, in April 1968, Lyndon Johnson, okay, was the ostensible president, but he was basically on his way out, okay? And Robert Kennedy, of course, was running for president and would have probably been president if he would not have been assassinated.
So all 4 major assassinations occurred under Johnson's watch.
No.
I mean, well, he started as the vice president. Kennedy was assassinated, became the president.
Right.
And then you got Malcom X and Martin Luther King and
JFK
JFK.
63, and Malcolm X is 1965. So yeah, Johnson was the vice president when Kennedy was assassinated, and he was the president when Malcolm was killed. Right.
And he was the president and who was the president when King was killed and
yeah, Johnson was right.
Johnson.
Right.
So it's Johnson all the way.
He was the vice president and the president. Correct.
It's an interesting little fact. Okay. So you're saying that this part of significance of the loss, and there's a great loss to humanity of Martin Luther King.
Right.
You just listen to the tapes; they're unparalleled in history for rhetorical skill and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But in
it
addition,
actually goes further than that because, as I tried to explain in the book, towards the end of his life, from say 1967 to 1968, it's a much different Martin Luther King than from the early days, from Montgomery to Selma, to even the March on Washington, the great, what most people, including myself, believe is the whole high point of both the Kennedy presidency and the civil rights movement, that great oration that he gave, in Washington in 1963. The latter-day Martin Luther King, 67, 68, is different, both as a man, as a thinker, as an activist. He's broadened out a long way from the civil rights movement, from voter registration, from integration, and he's broadening into he's become the anti-war person. Again, this is what drives the wedge between him and Johnson. Okay, is that King, I think in 1966 or 67, makes this great anti-Vietnam speech in New York. Okay, and then he fights against the war
at Riverside Church.
Right. He calls the United States the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. All right. Then he also is preparing this Poor People's March in 1968. He's broadening his scope, not just a black-white issue, okay, but a wide economic issue about the distribution of wealth, in the United States. And I think in 1967 he makes this quote about, we have to have a revolution in political values in this country. And so he becomes like RFK, he becomes more radicalized towards the end of his life. And you can see the influence of Malcolm on Martin Luther King.
Well, how do you mean that?
Because, Malcolm was always pictured as this revolutionary, as outside the mainstream, of political discourse, in this country. Because he said things like that. We have to have a revolution in values in this country. And saying something like that in public puts you outside the box. Okay? You become caricatured as, as kind of beyond the fringe, etc. Okay? Well, King is actually talking like this in 1967 and 1968. Okay, so he's kind of going beyond, you know, the guy who could get on TV and talk about civil rights, which of course everybody was for, you know, even back then, all right? You know, sooner or later it was going to have to happen. Well, he's going outside that. And he actually understood this, by the way, you know, that because other people are starting to criticize him for going beyond what he started as. You know, he's actually torn about this, but he decided to go ahead, you know, and do it anyway. All right, Robert Byrd, I mean, everybody likes Bob Byrd today.
Yeah, right.
Because he made a lot of really good speeches about Iraq. Take a look at the speeches he made about King in 1967 and 1968 in preparation for the...
Well, Byrd was a Klansman.
He was a former Klansman, right, for the Poor People's March on Washington. He was being he was attacking King about this whole thing. Didn't like the idea, you know, of people like camping out in Washington arguing about economic distribution of wealth in the United States at that time.
But what you're saying is he went across the bridge from racial, you know,
right.
Creating a remedy to racial discord. He went over towards
right.
class struggle.
Correct.
Like, you know, and I mean class struggle, I'm not a communist, but I'm talking about the fair, equitable distribution.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You get paid for the work you do. It doesn't all go to the owner.
And right, and this directly affected him, of course, because he actually, one of the reasons he was so anti-war is because, as most people who study history, Johnson's Great Society programs were being destroyed by the Vietnam War because there was so much money being spent on that war. Okay, there wasn't enough money to follow through the things that he wanted to do with the Great Society programs, and King went after him on specifically that issue.
But Johnson was controlling it, so he was sacrificing his domestic.
Johnson was controlling
the budget. He was sacrificing his domestic agenda to feed the war.
Right.
I mean, you'd think Johnson was in control.
Well, then you get into the whole issue of was he really running the Vietnam War? You know, and he actually thought that he was being a victim of the Vietnam War. That's the way he saw himself as, that he'd been lied to, deceived so many times by McNamara and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, et cetera, that it got totally out of control. He actually said that towards the end of his life. You know, they basically bamboozled me on this whole Vietnam War, and it destroyed my presidency.
Right.
You know?
So King goes over the bridge towards taking a broader scope.
Correct.
Beyond just let's learn to love each other.
Right.
To like let's look at the consequences of an unequitable society or top, you know, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. And also the use of foreign wars to control domestic policy.
Right.
So I'm just curious. This is something I've never thought of before, honestly, than just right now. In King's speech towards the end, when he was presaging or foretelling, you know, they're going to get me, and I'm not afraid, right? I think that was the last speech he made.
The night before he died.
The night before he died. It's, you know, there's someone, I don't want to try to paraphrase it, I don't know it. But he said he's not afraid, and he's aware that they're after him. And I always, in my mind, envision that as like, you know, some Southern racists. But it's possible that there were other forces that he was aware of, that he was picking on a big enemy.
Yeah, there's no doubt he was aware of it. In fact, when he saw the JFK assassination, sitting next to his wife on TV down in Atlanta, okay, when he heard the news about it, okay, you know, he actually told her, he said, "That's exactly what they're going to do to me." All right.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So in your book, are you going over the evidence of what?
We went through the whole trial, all the evidence actually presented at the trial. Okay, and we went through the whole thing before that, what Pepper was trying to introduce into evidence to actually reopen the case, the bullet test on the supposed rifle used by James Earl Ray that the Tennessee authorities say he used to kill King. And that's what he was trying to get Joe Brown to do, to retest the rifle to see if the so-called fatal bullet that killed King really did come from that rifle. Because every test done up until that time had come back, quote, inconclusive. They can't say yes, they can't say no. So he wanted to go ahead and make the ultimate test by cleaning out the barrel of the rifle to see if the markings were actually done by that rifle. And that's precisely at the point he was stopped. So, you know, if you have nothing to hide, you go ahead and do all the tests. In my opinion, the Tennessee authorities knew that if they went beyond that step, the test would come back that it wasn't that bullet that came from that rifle. Therefore, Ray did not kill King. And that's why they stopped the testing.
But there's supporting evidence for to indicate a conspiracy beside just the rifle.
Oh, there's much more. Yes, and that's the stuff that got brought into the record at the civil trial.
All the stuff about the police department and
right, the police department dropping back, about the mowing down of the foliage, okay, that would have hit an assassin below the hotel, okay, instead of above the hotel, of the changing of King's room, okay, from the first floor to the second floor, of Hoover's message to his media assets, broadcasting that King stays at the Holiday Inn. What is a black man doing staying at a white middle-class hotel when there's plenty of black hotels in Memphis, and that's what moved him to the Lorraine Motel. And then somebody came in a week before he was going to arrive there and moved him from the first floor to the second floor. The significance of that, of course, is that the first floor had an interior courtyard. No assassin could have killed him there. Okay, you go to the second floor, has the exterior balcony where he's an exposed target. Okay, and so that of course is the whole setup, you know, of the assassination.
So it indicates predetermined intent.
Right.
This is
he's maneuvering around.
It's not off the cuff. Just let's go do it. This was planned out.
Correct.
With many people involved.
Right. And then the guy who's actually standing over his body, Merrill McCullough, who's supposed to be a part of this invaders group, which is modeled on the Black Panthers. Okay, there's a famous picture of King, and this guy's standing over his dead body. Okay, and he's pointing at where James Earl Ray is supposed to be. Okay, across the street. All right, and this kid's name is Merrill McCullough, and like I said, he had been supposedly part of this group called the Invaders, modeled on the Black Panthers. It turns out that Merrill McCullough had been an informant for the Memphis Police Department, had been working for the FBI also. When Sam Donaldson heard about this, okay, he says, "You're not going to tell me," like smiling, "that this Merrill, you're not going to say Merrill McCullough works for the Central Intelligence Agency, do you?" And they said, "That's what we're saying." So on national TV, Sam Donaldson calls up CIA headquarters, okay, and he gets the desk officer there, and he goes, "Do you have a man named Merrill McCullough that works there?" And the guy doesn't know what's happening, so he looks at the roster and he goes, "Let's see. Yeah, we do." Because, "Do you mind if I talk to him?" So McCullough comes to the telephone, and Donaldson asks, "Are you the Merrill McCullough who's in that famous picture of Martin Luther King when he's dying on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel?" And he goes, "Yes." And he goes, "And you work for the Central Intelligence Agency?" And he goes, "Yes." "How long have you worked for the CIA?" 17 years. All right. So now we have the guy standing over King's that pointing to the wrong place. We now know was an undercover agent. Okay. All these years we weren't allowed to know that. Okay. Now why that's important is because the reason he ends up in Memphis at all is because the invaders had broken up his first demonstration in Memphis. Okay, for the sanitation workers there. He'd been down there in late March. The invaders break up that demonstration. Okay, they start throwing cans through windows, etc. And that's what brings him back, because he felt so bad that it turned out so badly that's why he comes back. So you're left with the supposition, did McCullough do this on purpose to bring King back as part of the setup that eventually moves him into the Lorraine Motel, moves him on the second floor, and then he's there pointing in the wrong place at this patsy, James Earl Ray?
Okay, Jim. Jim?
Yes.
You brought us to a climax. That's incredible. I'd read the Pepper book, and I didn't get that. I don't know if it's in the Pepper book or not.
Okay.
About that. What's his name again?
Merrill McCullough.
Merrill McCullough. If it was in there, it wasn't pronounced the way you just did. So we're out of time. You know how that happens on these shows. We'll have to do some more shows. But I just want to say something to the audience there. Thanks for watching. Keep those emails coming in. And I usually tell you to go out and do something good for somebody, but this time I want you to go out there and get yourself educated, find out what happened. You have a responsibility to history to know the truth, what really went down. So get this book. It's called The Assassinations, and you go find it somewhere. Thanks for watching. See you next time.